Greetings, my name is Ryan Nix. I'm a solutions architect with Amazon Web Services. Today I want to talk to you briefly around what are my observations around IBM customers on AWS getting away from undifferentiated heavy lifting, or more specifically, how are customers shifting towards a managed approach to their business goals. Working with customers who have been migrating workloads, specifically IBM or other large enterprise workloads from on-premises into the cloud, we've been looking at these customers and talking to them about what is driving the changes within their organizations. What are the things that are influencing customer decisions? And a few themes have come through in that discussion. One of which is customers are very much still in a hybrid context. Whether this is because of customers having a long-term migration strategy where they can't move things overnight and they're existing on the cloud as well as in other locations, typically on premises, but it could be more than that, for a prolonged period of time while they trickle things into the cloud. They have to exist in that hybrid state. Alternatively, this could be a customer that has a much more tangible hybrid existence where there are certain things that are highly unlikely to move out of their current location in the short term. This is typically things such as like mainframe investments that are still critical to the business, staying on premises, but other workloads moving into the cloud, and those systems need to coexist and interact with each other. The other element is customers are focusing on flexibility. How do I cater for all of my business needs as well as understand that there is a shift that could take place, that things could change? So how do I provide the greatest amount of flexibility, whether that is flexibility in my purchasing options or my deployment options or where I run workloads? How do I cater for what is right for the nuanced application team or the nuanced customer use case that I'm trying to address? Another theme that came through is, of course, going to complement that degree of flexibility, and that is agility. How do I easily and quickly do this? I don't want to have a scenario where things are flexible, but they are then slowed down. I want to be able to move quickly so I can get time to market, I can beat my competitors to market, and I can bring value to customers. And the fourth item is we're seeing customers focus on anything that will allow them to focus their resources on what is most critical to the business. And that typically sees resources such as developers building and writing application code that services what is important to customers, or it's building and writing application code that is critical to driving the next innovation, supporting those flexibility and those agility aspects. From an infrastructure or an administrative standpoint, we're seeing admin resources being refocused on what is critical to the business and less so focusing on keeping the lights on, if you will. To this effect, we see customers adopt AWS as their preferred cloud of choice for several reasons. One of the things that they're attracted to with AWS is first and foremost the scalability. They can run at scale in their existing environments, but you end up in a situation where you can scale to a point and then you get stuck in a procurement cycle that for some customers takes very long. With AWS, you can scale up or scale down with a simple click of a button or an API call or a change to your infrastructure as code. And this sees customers meeting that flexibility requirement combined with that agility. Availability, AWS has already been marked by Gartner as in the magic quadrant for resilience and availability, citing that we have less outages as a cloud provider than competitors. But at the same time, customers are attracted to things such as the well-architected review, where third parties such as ISVs and partners go through a well-architected review to make sure what they're bringing to customers via AWS also has that security, that resilience mindset. The native services that AWS provides are all built from the ground up to be highly scalable, to be elastic, to be resilient, to be secure. And all of these things translate to customers don't have to solve those challenges themselves. They have a collection of building blocks that they can easily adopt. And what's growing now is a cost concern, where customers are becoming more and more focused on the cost pillar of the well-architected review and starting to scrutinize, how can I get more with a little bit less out of my business? How can I achieve that increased efficiency, if you will? And then for many of the customers I work with, the native portfolio of AWS services is attractive and compelling. They want to combine these with the existing investments that they already have. So it's not uncommon for me to see customers move workloads from on-premises or other locations into AWS and then adopt AWS native services to complement those, whether those are database or storage systems or security layers. There is a variety of different use cases. So when customers are making the move to AWS, one of the things that I've observed is they're not just moving to AWS, they're also taking a shift towards managed. They're exploring how can they disconnect from some of the investments that they already have and potentially replace those with a more managed alternative. Now, this is not new. AWS has been taking care of the undifferentiated heavy lifting for customers for many years, whether that is focusing on the underlying nuts and bolts of a virtualization stack when a customer uses EC2, or focusing on some of the nitty-gritties of managing storage with something like EBS, or I think most notably something like the Amazon Relational Database Service, RDS, where a customer can focus on the database itself for their application workload, and AWS worries about the actual database administration of keeping the server up and running, dealing with the replication, dealing with the backups, dealing with making that a resilient, highly available service. Customers are looking at this and saying, how can I get this in other parts of my current business investments? So how do I do this with adoption of AWS native services? How do I adopt other managed services that I may already have? Or do I move from what I'm currently doing myself towards some sort of ISV provided SaaS offering, all on AWS? Let's unpack some of the more common ones here. Most of the customers I work with are adopting Red Hat OpenShift, whether that is as part of a software stack that runs on top of OpenShift, or alternatively, it's part of a broader modernization strategy where developers are building application code and running it as containerized microservices. With OpenShift, a lot of customers are saying, I see the value in OpenShift, but I don't want to do all of this myself. Let me adopt a more managed option. So somewhere where somebody else is doing that undifferentiated heavy lifting on my behalf. So OpenShift on AWS has a couple of options. Many customers are using the self-managed OpenShift Container Platform, OCP, on premises. And when they come to AWS, they have a choice. Do I bring my self-managed OpenShift and run it on AWS and continue to do it myself? Highly customizable option, but you're responsible for everything. Over the last 2 years, most of the customers I engage with have opted to move to a managed version of OpenShift, something like the Red Hat OpenShift service on AWS. What this does is it shifts the responsibility of maintaining the control plane, the data plane, OpenShift in itself, to somebody other than the customer. In this case, managed OpenShift is managed by Red Hat themselves, so they have an SRE team in the background that is doing telemetry on that environment and managing the OpenShift, making sure that OpenShift is there doing what it needs to do, allowing your resources to focus on the workloads that you're running on top of OpenShift. Incidentally, managed OpenShift is jointly supported, so you do see the customer having a choice of, do I reach out to Red Hat, or alternatively, do I reach out to AWS? And we have escalation paths in the background to facilitate the customer not needing to run around. If we have a look at a OpenShift environment, and that is a lot of little building blocks put together when you start looking at the broader holistic modernization strategy. When customers are doing this themselves, there's a lot that they're actually responsible for, whether that is user management, credential management, project and quota management, cluster creations. When we shift to manage OpenShift, a larger chunk of this falls outside of the responsibility of the customer, and they can refocus their efforts somewhere else. So what the customer becomes really responsible for is the users, the applications themselves, and maybe the identity providers. The rest is done through managed OpenShift. So huge benefit to shifting there. Another thing that we're seeing is an architectural shift in OpenShift away from the traditional everything is in the customer account. So introducing something like hosted control planes. Now, hosted control planes have a couple of benefits. First and foremost, there is a reduction of time to provisioning. Because we are no longer building out OpenShift into the customer's account in a linear procedural process, we can deploy the control plane in one location, we can deploy parts of the data plane in parallel in the customer's account. So because we're parallelizing the deployment process, we can gain a bit of speed here. SRE management also shifts outside of the customer account and goes through a service team account. But I think the big draw card here for customers is a cost reduction. We're shifting things that are part of OpenShift out of the customer's account so the customer doesn't incur those costs as part of their typical billing. Let's take a moment and have a look at a stereotypical OpenShift architecture on AWS. We would typically see everything that is OpenShift inside the customer's account spanning 3 availability zones. So whether that is the control plane, the master nodes, the infrastructure nodes, and then you'd have the actual compute layer or the worker nodes, everything would be in the customer's account. With hosted control plane, we start to shift some of those components out of the customer's account. So first and foremost, we're going to take that control plane, the actual master nodes, the etcd layer of OpenShift, and we'll put that into a separate account, which is the service team account. We are going to take the infrastructure nodes, and what we'll do is we're not going to move those to a different account, but what we'll do is we'll move the workloads, the components that are running on those, and shimmy those around a little bit. So we'll remove those out of the customer account, and we'll put some of those functions onto the master nodes in the service team account. Other configurations, such as the OpenShift routing layer, that kind of stuff, we'll collapse those down onto the compute nodes. But if you look at the end result, we end up with something that is dramatically different from the older architecture. Much of what was in the account has now disappeared. So the underlying AWS infrastructure costs of EC2 instances, storage, now evaporates, and the customer's only paying for the compute layer. This also brings managed OpenShift into a very similar comparative design to other AWS container offerings, which means customers who are familiar with things like EKS again see that familiarity when they're looking at OpenShift. And then, of course, we have the private link connection that allows our compute layer in the customer account to engage with the actual control plane in the service team account. So we're definitely seeing customers adopt managed OpenShift, and now an additional step to that is customers adopting hosted control plane as the preferred architecture. When customers move workloads into AWS, data has gravity. So a large portion of that migration ends up being some form of data. Could be relational, could be non-relational data, but the databases are also something where customers are saying, I want to explore how do I move to a managed database? Whether that is to increase the efficiency of having somebody else manage it for me, whether it is to reduce costs, or whether I'm looking for features and innovations that are going to come from somebody else being able to manage my database, and I focus on something that's important to the business. At AWS, we have had managed databases, or at least managed relational databases, for a very long time now, supporting a variety of different engines. And that managed database architecture allows for AWS to focus on automatic failover, backup and recovery, upgrade processes, scaling, the security of it, automated patch management, which frees up the customer to focus on the database structure that's important to their application workloads and what they're trying to achieve. So the actual schema design, the query execution, and actual optimizations internally in the database. What we've seen is AWS has a very broad collection of purpose-built databases. So whether that is something non-relational, or you're looking at a key value pair, something like DynamoDB, or whether you're looking at some sort of document-based structure with DocumentDB, some sort of caching enabled through Elasticache, graph databases, in-memory, wide column, ledger, time series. There is a purpose-built database on AWS to cater for nearly every single customer requirement. And as customers are migrating their workloads in, many customers are exploring, how do I take my existing database and potentially shift over to something else that could be more complementary? With IBM workloads on AWS, as I mentioned, many customers are bringing their existing investments, and these existing investments, whether they are IBM Cloud Paks, or whether they're part of the Watson portfolio, or whether they are related to something like Maximo or FileNet, all of these IBM products and investments have some dependency on a relational database. Whether the data that they're feeding in and analyzing is coming from a relational database, or alternatively components of that product are run inside a database such as the metadata in FileNet. With customers bringing these existing IBM investments, one of the things that they're exploring is, how do I adopt a managed database to complement that? So Amazon's RDS now supports, one of the exciting things is DB2 as an option, an engine that you could run with that product. And these are supported with many of these IBM products. So you can bring your IBM investment, shift to a managed database, and you still have the options of any of the supported engines that are supported by that IBM product, whether it's Microsoft SQL Server, whether it's Oracle, DB2, or Postgres in some of the newer products, changing or adding an engine type, if you will. As I said, data has gravity, so storage. AWS has a broad, again, purpose-built approach to providing storage, whether that is object storage through Amazon S3, or whether it is file storage through something like EBS, or shared storage options such as you would get with Elastic File System or with FSx. There's a lot of different options here, and again, customers are looking at, how do I bring my existing investments and how can I provide a scalable, resilient, managed storage layer to complement my workloads. So we're absolutely seeing customers adopt things like S3 for object storage, especially if you're looking at things like FileNet, or you're looking at some of the IBM data and AI portfolio. Again, looking at shared storage, very popular for customers to adopt something like the Elastic File System or FSx NetApp on tap to complement their OpenShift environments. So these options coming in here, reduced configuration effort, fully elastic, there's no provisioning of the storage. If you look at something like S3 as an example, it dynamically grows as you consume. You're not provisioning the story preemptively. So you're dealing with a situation where you are paying for what you use. And you can interact with these anywhere. So for those hybrid customers, their workloads could be running on AWS, talking to the storage, or alternatively, they could have on-premises workloads also gaining the benefit from these different storage options. If we look at this in the context of a IBM workload running on top of something like managed OpenShift, you can see some of the components of that application stack where they are object related, getting a benefit from interacting with S3. At the same time, you can see components of a IBM Cloud Pak that require shared storage, having a shared storage layer. Now, typically, you could end up with a more traditional approach where you are building compute nodes, something like a virtual machine, and adding volumes to it to cater for that shared storage layer within OpenShift. What that means is you're then placing compute resources, EC2 instances, into 3 availability zones, and you're adding disk storage in the form of EBS to those, and you're duplicating that across all 3 of the availability zones for resilience, that means that you're duplicating the costs of those resources, you're duplicating the costs of the infrastructure, and you'd need to make sure that the data is consistent across all 3 of those locations, so there is synchronization or replication of the data, which incurs data transfer costs. So this older way of doing it is effective. However, you do need to be realistic, is you're going to pay for the architecture components thereof. Shifting to something like EFS and FSX NetApp on tap, the customer doesn't have those resources running in their account. Instead, what they have is they very simply have endpoints in the account, and those components where the data is replicated, those components where the resilience model is run inside the product team's accounts themselves. So the customer doesn't incur those costs. They get a dramatic reduction in cost around the data transfer as well as the duplication of resources, which is why we're seeing a lot more customers shift not just to a managed option to refocus their resources, but also cut down on underlying infrastructure and the cost related to it. Then, of course, we have those customers who are taking, in this case, IBM software that is an existing investment, but shifting away from managing it themselves and moving towards SaaS options. And IBM has a very broad portfolio of products that they have released via the AWS marketplace as a SaaS option, meaning that the workload is run by IBM on behalf of the customer, and the customer can consume those services. So whether this is a queuing or a messaging system, whether it is part of the Watson portfolio for data and AI, whether it is part of an automation, so whether it is in Stana, whether it is part of a FinOps strategy, there is a very broad and constantly growing portfolio of products available via the AWS marketplace, and more importantly as a SaaS option. One thing that we need to be very cognizant of is with any adoption of the cloud, any migration, it's never just one thing. The customer never brings just one workload. They may bring something like a Cloud Pak for data that shifts into AWS. That application has data related to it, so we very commonly see the data being moved at a later stage. So what we see is the gravitational pull of one thing following the next. So a application workload being brought into AWS will then bring a relational database, which will then bring an ETL solution, which will then bring a warehousing solution. So it is a steady stream of things being migrated into AWS or built net new. And it is important that we scrutinize or at least question, what is that next workload? How do we streamline this, and how do we think about not just what is immediately in front of me, but what is going to happen next? But I can say with absolute certainty, customers are not done moving their workloads into the cloud. They're not done modernizing their workloads, and they simply are starting the journey of moving to a managed option where they are freeing up their resources and focusing on what is absolutely critical to the business to achieve that agility that they're looking for to drive what is important to customers. Thank you. I hope that this has been informative, and I hope it has planted a seed of exploration.